people really just want to see what's going on. They want to hear about, they want to know what's up in the newsroom and what we're talking about and a little bit behind the scenes. So you've never been shy about that, So, we're going to be running these separately, and then we're going to do that big marathon. But I guess basically, so for you, I'm trying to think, actually, I don't know why I'm having trouble thinking of this. You had your blog. Where were you writing primarily before you were working with us? Were you doing prison coverage?
Truth Out. Truth. I wrote mostly for Truth Out, and Boston Magazine before that. Both of them, Truth Out and Boston Magazine.
And Truth Out, of course, a national progressive outlet. But so what's it like? Do you find that when you were? I mean, I think that sometimes when something comes out in a national outlet, it actually makes a bigger splash. People really, put a lot of stock in that. But when you're writing about local issues for a national outlet, what are the good parts and the bad part?
Well, that was the problem, really, is that I had to really turn all the Massachusetts stories into more national stories, and I really wanted. I think the Massachusetts stories are really important, and so. What I've found is that focusing on the story here and then connecting it to a national picture has actually gotten me a lot of recognition from the Marshall Project and from Prison Legal News and other people that want to republish our stuff. But that acknowledge our stuff. Like that last thing, the article that I did on I just like to say the word Makofu, even though it's Mass Correctional Officers Federated Union, Makofu. Writing about them is really important because what they're doing is evocative of what other unions are doing across the United States. So that writing it from that perspective, getting the local angle, and then saying, hey, look what's happening across the United States is kind of it's more interesting to me because I can really hone in on what is most important to me.
So tell me, like, what's I don't know. I was gonna ask, like, what's unique about Massachusetts prisons. I guess what should people know in general? I mean, it's really not well covered. I mean, I guess if people listen to like NPR, local NPR, they might get some good stuff on of course, from WBUR, but I just mean, like, in general, the granular stuff about prisons in Massachusetts. And I'm wondering, it's a two-part question. Are there any states where there just is, like, if I'm in California, is there really good coverage of prisons, or are prisons just kind of forgotten everywhere, and how bad off are we in Mass,
Yeah, I'd say New York has good coverage. California to some extent, but not great, not always great. Better than Massachusetts. I think what happens is that, well, first of all, people think we're liberal because we're known as a liberal state. They think our prisons are the same way, and that's not true. So that's number one. We have more people serving life without parole than many states across the country. Even though like if you talk to the sheriffs, and if you don't know this stuff, you get sucked in by these incredibly bad ideas, bad stuff that's out there. And most reporters don't take the time or have the time. I don't want to say they don't take it. A lot of them don't have the time to really delve into what's going on. And that's what's so great that I feel like I do with you, have the ability and time to really delve in, so that if we look at, one small thing, like, a question like, why are there so many people serving life without parole in Massachusetts? We would find out that our sentencing is pretty crappy, and we do sentence people to harsh sentences, and we do have a punitive stance on a lot of things that people don't quite acknowledge. I think, I can't remember exactly what article it was, Chris, but I think it was the one when I was writing about the women serving life without parole, and the Sentencing Project report had just come out. What was fascinating about that is I think the number of women in Massachusetts sentenced to life sentences, 1 in 6, something we wouldn't have guessed. And so, yeah, we're really not progressive. Why? I think we have Puritan, punitive values. I mean, just knowing that when we got rid of the death penalty, immediately, like many states, boom, we put in life without parole. Vermont will probably be the first state that actually gets rid of life without parole. And then maybe Massachusetts will consider it will, even though it's in legislation now, they're not going to consider it seriously.
So all of this stuff, I think one thing about your reporting that, it's kind of, it's almost across the board. We do original reporting. That's the reason we have BINJ. But with you, it's like, because, well, first of all, I want to back up. So you had said that, this is the kind of thing where we're not blaming reporters. If you're like a small town reporter and there happens to be a prison in your town, that's like a whole other job. That could be a whole beat. It could be 2-3 people. But it's prisons, in my experience, it's one of those issues where, like, if it's there and you don't have to cover it, and you're not always covering it, it's prohibitive. There's a lot of prohibitive things. So you are one of our reporters. Thankfully, you have the time. I mean, the amount of time you put into this stuff, you should be paid, extraordinarily. I don't think people really get it, and they don't want people reporting on this stuff. It's not conspiracy theory. We're not here screaming that, they're sitting there stopping you at the door with machine guns, although I guess they kind of are. But can you just talk about some of the hurdles? So maybe just like, I know right now we're in the digital age, but just let's back up for a second. In normal times, when you can visit prisons, can you just tell people what you have to go through to go speak to an inmate, a prisoner? We don't use the word inmate.
Well, first of all, you really have to lie. If you say you're a reporter, you have less chance of getting information and getting in than if people don't necessarily know that you are a reporter. That's pathetic.
And just so people understand, yes, that's probably against the law, but we're here asking you for money for reporting. Next year, we'll ask you for money for lawsuits, but that kind of proactive lawyering it's not really doable. That would cost tens of thousands of dollars.
Incredibly problematic. So here's an example. So I can write to people and get information from people, but if I was asked to go in for the Lifers group, and I said, that I'm going to write an article about it or something. But they said to me, if you want to come in twice, you have to become a volunteer. If you become a volunteer, you can't communicate with people anymore. So the prison sets up rules so they make it very hard for you. And then if you say you're a reporter, they don't necessarily give you access. So it's a double-edged thing. As soon as they know that you're reporting on something,
and I'll also go as far as to say it's not safe. It's not safe. It's not a safe environment. The guards are hostile, and then virtually though, it's not like they've made it any easier. So
no, because
we've been talking about prison, but there's the parole issue too. So tell us about the parole board.
Let's talk about parole board a second. So when I've been covering, let's just, I had to cover, and I wanted to cover Thomas Kuntz, a person's commutation hearing, the first commutation in Massachusetts in 6 years, first lifer in 10 years. And I wanted to cover that important issue. They would not let me go on Zoom, even though the commutation was held on Zoom. They made me listen to a 5-hour hearing, even though I was a reporter, on the phone. So the parole board has hurdles that make it really difficult. They don't allow you to record anything. They tell you you can listen, but you can't record it, and you have to listen on your phone. And that goes for many other things. You're not allowed to record things. You can listen, but you can't go on. You can't be there. Also with COVID, a lot of, it's interesting, court cases, I've actually gone on Zoom for some court cases. They let me on Zoom to go in the court, but they won't let me on Zoom for the parole board, even if I'm covering it. That's incredibly problematic. Also problematic. This organization that I'm involved with, it's called Parole Watch, people who go to parole hearings. One of the women staged a campaign to get the parole board to wear masks. They were not wearing masks, so that you went to a hearing and you went in a room with a bunch of people and a person who came from a prison, and no one was wearing masks.
And I'll say, like, this is like, if that happened even in the state legislature, which barely gets covered, and some like Republican asshole showed up and didn't have a mask on, it would make the news. But with this,
right.
Even these kind of theatrics don't make headlines. You
Well,
made some headlines by stopping a parole board appointee. That's a BINJ story not long ago, and that wasn't necessarily the purpose. You put it out there. This is what kind of candidate they're proposing. This stuff just happens so behind closed doors, but it goes without saying that. Listen, I'm happy to blame, like today, it's election day that we're speaking, and a lot of people aren't voting, and I do blame the people who don't vote for things that happen. I'm not here to coddle the most people who really could care less. But at the same time, with these topics, these are things that are really being held against us. You don't have, it's not just the apathetic who are not seeing these stories. So you're getting them out there.
Could I just say something about the story that I'm going to be working on for this month, which is on transparency, which is exactly what the lack of transparency, exactly what we're talking about. So here we know that there's applications to the parole board, and part of my coverage of this story is that you can't find out who's applied. There's no way to find out who's applied until the governor nominates somebody to be on the parole board. Even the governor's counselors cannot find out who's applied for the board. Governor's counselors are the people who ultimately approve parole board members. And
they don't know formally, but they're whipping them, right? They're figuring out if they would vote for these people, especially
the governor's counselors. They might talk to the governor and say, okay, I think you should, so-and-so's interested in the parole board. Look at her.
Advice and consent
Exactly. And I thought of George when you said that, but the thing George used to work in the State House and was the only person who really helped us enormously getting into files and so on. There's nobody there now. I mean, actually, I could get into files, but it's really difficult. And this is part of this. I mean, that's another thing about Massachusetts. You asked one of the things that I think is important for people to know about Massachusetts. Incredibly hard to get information.
Yeah.
Very hard. And
we spend a lot of money every year. You with your stuff, I think you've mostly handled it yourself. So I assume and hope that it hasn't been that much. But I mean, we just had one the other day, Laura Kiesel, $3,000 they want for some like department. It's related to rat poison and traps. It's just it's just total nonsense. So
totally.
But it's this, and also of course horrible. The executive branches, we can't even see it. They're immune. So
lack of transparency, the secret life of parole, the secret life of probation. I mean, probation is actually better than parole, but the secret, I mean, we haven't really written about probation. It's better in that it's more transparent. But prisons, and just yesterday, Chris, I went to an online SJC hearing about
it's a Supreme Judicial Court for anyone out there.
For one of our sheriffs, Hodgson, trying to make money off the backs of prisoners' phone calls. This is
Thomas Hodgson, by the way, is a MAGA guy. For those out there who aren't familiar, he is he's an explosive character. He does things for effect of
and he's keeping them. He says he has a right to keep the money from Securus's all of this, and so PLS, Prisoner Legal Services, filed a lawsuit against him. Prisoners filed a lawsuit against it. Was a case lawsuit, but PLS took it to court. And it was really interesting. But I have no idea. I mean, that's another thing. Our SJC, since Ralph Gantz died is moved considerably to the right. And people don't know that. It's we have people on the Supreme Judicial Court who are not Ralph Gantz. Ralph Gantz was amazing. I mean, Kim Budd is a new leader and she's got some good views, but the whole court, like the rest of the courts in the country, has swung somewhat to the right.
You know, you're giving me, it's funny. I'm always the one telling you, we got to go raise money. We don't have the cash right now, but now you're making me think we need somebody to cover this is not a beer, by the way. This is a hop tea, I swear.
Well, I want to cover this, but we need, I mean, this
no,
is.
Of course, but imagine we had you on prison and parole and probation, and we had somebody covering this SJC. I mean, because there's obviously a lot of stuff coming out of there. But I mean, it just goes to show there's just so much. And we had lucked out last year, and hopefully we'll get the team back together next year. But 2020 early and through the first half of 2021, we did a lot of really solid prison reporting with you leading the way. And then we had like a whole bunch of young reporters who happen to be interested in the topic. And I have to say, a lot of those reporters are young people coming out of like grad school or even undergrad, where their professors encourage that kind of reporting. But unfortunately, when they get to the point where they're in newsrooms and stuff like that, there's either not time for it or they're not, pushed to pursue it. And it, like we said, it's really tough. You have access is really difficult. Thankfully, a lot of these, the advocacy organizations are great for connecting with people.
Let me just interrupt you for a second. This is a really important thing about people do not have, and you said this once to me, Chris. I over my years of working in, writing about prisons, and I've been writing about this, since I first worked at Framingham Women's Prison when I, was a lot younger and wrote my first book. And, I've developed connections with people behind bars and connections with people to get to people behind bars. But I just got a letter this week from someone who sent me the name, which we can't publish, but it's fascinating, the names of 8 guards at Old Colony who are bragging about not getting the vaccine. And, people write to me because they know I care. They write to me and they say, I can't believe this is going on, because what happens now is people are so desperate for the conditions they're living in. They feel like, they get one voice saying something, they want that voice to say everything. It's sad, but it's true.
So now you're talking about of course, how much longer do the unvaccinated, are they still in there, the unvaccinated?
Well, that's what he was telling me, is
they're
that
not supposed to be now though, right?
There's a quote unquote progressive sanctions. So, if they're unvaccinated, they have a certain number of days where they're supposed to not be there, or maybe they're still there. And they
imagine being a prison guard and not wanting to be vaccinated, like in that I mean, actually,
yeah, I can.
We still have a couple minutes here. Can you just, I mean, it's backtracking a little bit, but we've just been through one of the most unbelievable, and we're not through it. What I mean through, talk about like privileged talk. Like, so talk about what the hell has gone on here in the past year and a half. What's going on? That it's
when I tried to, so the first time I wrote that article in February, the first article I wrote about what the officers were doing was when we got the stats that over half the officers had vaccine. It was February.
Wow.
Actually, February. I checked it. And that was early because
you went and got those yourself, I think, right?
No, I didn't I got them from people who are keeping data online. Okay. That was from the special master, the person who who knew how many people had refused the vaccine, kept track of that. That something like at that time, over 65% of prisoners had gotten vaccinated and under 50% of officers had gotten vaccinated. And so I went to talk to a former officer who told me how it was part of the culture. Macho, a little coronavirus isn't going to hurt me. I'm not getting a vaccine. I don't need, and so it's part of a mentality of coolness. I know it doesn't make any sense. Coolness, toughness, and not wanting to wear a mask, the whole anti-vax mentality, but take it up a step to what a macho toxic masculinity is inside prisons. So that's where it starts. And then what happened is add that to this sort of, I have a right to determine my own fate mentality. I have a right to my own health care mentality. And applying for, I think a lot of officers have also, quote, illegally applied for religious exemptions. I don't know what religion they are, but they're applying for religious exemptions to
Nihilism.
get out of it.
Wow. All right. Well, and that story continues too. So the work really never ends. What do you see as the, last year in 2019, you focused a lot on parole and looking, we did the big solution series. I'm sorry, 2020. Just looking at what was happening elsewhere, kind of comparing that to mass. Obviously, COVID has kind of overlapped 2020, 2021. And certainly this vaccine story has been an ongoing thing that you've really done great coverage of. If you have your crystal ball, what do you see? Are there some big decisions? What are the obviously you have a great ear to the activist and advocacy community. What are people really pushing for? And I'll just throw another thing on top of there. There's also this huge issue, and we've covered it extensively. You have, Dan Atkinson has, other reporters have with us, with the women's prison. Are we going to get a new women's prison in Massachusetts? So all of the above, just finish this off. Tell us, what are they going to be, what are the big stories? What do you think, what do you anticipate yourself
Well, I think
needing this funding to cover?
Yeah, I think the transparency is a big story.
Okay.
In terms of back to the secrecy question, the underbelly of what's going on. I think it will be interesting to see. Gloria, this whole, I'm interested in this whole thing, which we haven't explored yet, of how many people become judges who come out of the parole board. This whole movement from chair of the board to judge. One of the people is just about to apply to be a judge, Gloria Maroney, and that happened with Paul Tressler. It happened with Josh Wall. They all come out of Suffolk County. I think a big story is going to be the relationship of, it's an interesting story, the relationship of the parole board to the police, in the sense of people are recusing themselves who are connected. I think really an important story are the racial implications, which we don't have that much data on yet, and we need the racial implications of our sentencing, of our parole practices, of our probation practices. They've tried to do these commissions, which were developed by the legislature, which I think are 100% ineffective. And I think you were still left with the questions of what terrible racial policies we have in Massachusetts, which gets back to your first question, which is we are not a good state with our issues on race.
No doubt about it. Well, all right. Well, thank you very much. I'm gonna wrap this up, and we're gonna keep it going. We're gonna keep